3 weeks ago, the Heritage Foundation published, it's 4 weeks ago now, the Index of Economic Freedom, which we have published for 16 years in a row. And for the first time in the 16-year history of the index, the United States was scored as a mostly free country. Not a free country, but a mostly free country. Congress is at the center of the problem solving of this problem. Dependency creating programs cannot be expanded anymore. So the first thing we have to do is stop the expansion of these programs. The Bush administration made massive expansions to educational support to college students, so much so now that we're probably looking at deleveraging of student loans on a magnitude equal to the deleveraging of some of the commercial property stuff that's going on. It could be very damaging to the country. So we need to reverse those processes. Remember, if aid is given at the federal level that's substituting for aid that was given at the local level, that impetus for giving that aid is still at the local level. So we need to support civil society efforts. Housing support. The Clinton administration pretty much reversed 30 years of housing policy in this country and began to privatize public housing. That was reversed in the 8 years of the Republican administration. That needs to go back to where it was going. Subsidies for food aid. We are producing so many dollars are going into food support now that don't end up in food. We need to have a much more rational, focused food support program through the Department of Agriculture. And I could go on and on. Do no harm is basically my message there. I mean, we need to put reasonable brakes on the growth of these programs. Tax reform is desperately needed in order to expand the number of people who pay taxes. You know, that's weird to hear here at the Heritage Foundation. But if you're going to have a tax system, it should be at a very low rate, and a lot of people should be a part of it. That's the way you keep the base broad, and you also make sure that your tax system, being broadly based, is filled with people watching government. If you only have a few people paying taxes, who's watching government's efforts to raise those taxes? Just a few people. So
what we've seen is what the fighting issue that came down to is this Consumer Financial Protection Agency. Now, when this thing was introduced last summer, it was crazy town. I mean, this was a power grab like something you've never seen before, a throwback to sort of Nixon-era regulation on steroids in terms of the command and control, insulated, unaccountable bureaucracy issuing command and control type mandates that would, harm the economy and harm consumers. Since that time, it's been pared back a lot. Where things seem to stand right now, I think, is actually in a pretty good place, which is what they're talking about is having something like a CFPA. Again, that's Consumer Financial Protection Agency, but it would be inside the Federal Reserve. Leave aside the question of where it should be. Why that makes sense to me is that there's always been a core issue related to the CFPA, which is whether or not it was going to be a completely standalone sort of thing that would do just consumer protection, or whether was it going to be integrated into some institution that would do both consumer protection and safety and soundness. What they seem to be gravitating to, which is combining consumer protection and safety and soundness, and that makes sense.
What we've seen over the past 25 years or so is an increasing layer of complicated regulation and often contradictory regulation imposed on the market. A lot of these are driven primarily by lawyers who have brought lawsuits that have required legalistic type disclosures, and regulators who have regulated without thinking about how it fits together with what consumers are trying to accomplish. There are a lot of things that could be done to streamline regulations, to simplify regulations. And what that really begins with is repealing old regulations and thinking about how to make regulations more consumer friendly rather than lawyer and regulator friendly.
What about the CFPA should consumers know prior to it passing or being put forth?
The CFPA, as originally introduced, would have been probably the biggest power grab, the largest bureaucracy that we would have seen in a long time when it comes to consumer credit. It would have completely transformed the consumer credit market, and not for the good for consumers. It would have had the power to ban a lot of terms and products, and would have been heavy-handed command and control regulation at its worst. Over time, the excesses of that proposal as originally introduced has been pared back a bit. There's a lot of ideas now about how to try to make it more consumer friendly. They've talked about, instead of a standalone entity, it would be placed within the Federal Reserve, and most importantly, it would combine consumer protection with safety and soundness to make sure that what banks were doing was good for consumers, but also that competition and the safety and soundness of the banking industry was preserved and not weakened by a wrong-headed, overzealous regulation.
The people are increasingly aware of all these regulations and all of the bureaucracy that's going on within Congress. What sort of role could the media play to help increase their awareness even more?
What the media needs to understand on these financial reform issues is that this isn't just an issue of whether you're for or against consumers. There are two different ways you can think about consumer regulation. One would be a system that promotes consumer choice and competition in consumer shopping. We could call that market reinforcing regulation. The other is the idea that animates something like CFPA, which is what we could call market replacing regulation. It is a system of bureaucratic command and control regulation, paternalistic view of consumers, and a view of regulation that sees consumers as having to be protected against banks, rather than consumers as being having the ability to shop, to make decisions about what's right for them and their families. That sort of regulation is a recipe for stagnation, a limitation on consumer choice, and in the end, higher prices and less attractive products for consumers. One of the things that's been a big issue in Washington is, why aren't banks lending? After they gave all the bailout money and everything else, we haven't seen an increase in lending. And what you hear from businessmen around the country is that there are two reasons, really. It's Congress and it's the bureaucracy. The main reason is Congress. We're in an environment of incredible legislative uncertainty, with perhaps new regulations on cap and trade, on health care, financial regulations, and everything else. And in that sort of environment, it's almost impossible to make a loan and understand whether it's going to be paid back. Secondly, what we see is Congress bringing about potential regulations on lending specifically, whether it's credit cards, CFPA, or whatever the issue may be. Banks have to make a choice when they make a loan. Either they have to be able to price the loan accurately, or they need to reduce their risk and their loan exposure. So what we're seeing is, to the extent that Congress regulates in a way that makes it more difficult to price the risk of a loan, banks are doing exactly what you would predict. They're lending less, they're lending to fewer people, and they're making fewer loans. Most consumers, or a lot of consumers, will recognize that their credit card issuers, for instance, have slashed credit lines. They've canceled credit cards. All this is a reflection of the regulatory environment that we see in Washington, where Congress is really interfering with the ability to price risk accurately. And we're seeing the logical consequences of that, which is consumers and small businesses are having less access to credit.